Hi everyone, Dr. Oliver here with a discussion of family conflict and family stress. Now, before we get started, a couple things to keep in mind is that we are covering two chapters here from your Turner and West textbook, so make sure that you are reading both of those chapters. And this lecture includes a lot of discussions about a lot of things. For instance, we'll talk about conflict, power, violence, stress, and resilience, and how they connect to or build upon one another. So again, make sure that you are focusing on the two different textbook readings for this lesson. Now, before we get into anything else, we need to define concepts first. And let's start with the discussion of conflict. Now, conflict, as you can see how your textbook defines it, is an interaction process whereby family members perceive a disagreement about goals, rules, roles, culture, and or patterns of communication. Now, your textbook authors make a big point about how they conceptualize conflict in its necessary definition for process and for perception. So, process. Conflict is viewed as a process within the family because conflict can develop and change over time. So as families change, so too do their conflict episodes. If we didn't think of conflict as a process, we would be undermining what we've learned in previous readings and lectures thus far about how family systems change and adapt. So a great example that the book uses is that parents often mention that they're in conflict with children over messy bedrooms. But this same conflict topic changes focus over time. So parents empathize or emphasize a clean room as a way to teach children good habits in early years. But as the children reach adolescence, many parents enforce room cleanup in an effort to assert power over potentially rebelling adolescents. So that shows that conflict is a process. It changes over time. The same conflict topic can be perceived differently because of this process. Now, perception is also needed in understanding familial conflict. Conflict may exist both because family members actually disagree, or it may exist because they mistakenly believe that they disagree, or they perceive that there's a disagreement. Another example your book uses is that two parents in conflict over their daughter getting a nose piercing. The dad may not really have wanted the daughter to get a nose ring, but he wasn't as vocal as the mom. So that could lead to conflict between these two spouses over the mother's assumption that the dad was in agreement with the piercing, even though he originally wasn't. So this mother perceived that there was a disagreement here when really they were on the same page. Another example could be that we may see something as mundane, such as taking out the trash, but our partner or our parent may see this same behavior as a larger issue or a more intense conflict over, say, the division of household labor. So perception is important to keep in mind when we're talking about conflict within the family. We also know conflict in the family can be productive or destructive. So productive conflict usually serves to clarify family boundaries and foster independence of family members, leading to stronger relationships and ways of seeing through the problem or conflict in order to reach a solution. Now, productive conflict is typically solvable conflict. Solvable conflicts are those that a family can solve with the right communication tactics and responses. For example, a conflict between a parent and child over disciplining the child because they broke a rule could actually lead to learning about listening and teaching them how to listen effectively, and could be a way to reaffirm the values of open communication for the family. Now, destructive conflict leads to lower family relational satisfaction, and it can even unravel relationships. Destructive conflict is often indicative of perpetual or serial arguments. Now, these are arguments that are difficult to solve because they are rooted in conflicting values, roles, or beliefs. So it's not that you did a behavior that broke a rule that therefore you're going to get disciplined for to teach you a lesson, but you tend to fall into disagreements over something because you do not share the same values as this family member that you're in conflict with. So it's hard to change, or we may be unwilling to change our values, and thus these types of conflict tend to repeat or become serial. Now we're going to talk about one big theory in regards to conflict in this course. And before we talk about the actual theory, I want to give you some background on where it got its name, because it is a pretty unique name that it uses. And this is the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Now, this is a theory created by Gottman in the 90s, and he derived this term off of a common painting that had been in the Renaissance era and before. And this is a version of the painting called the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Now, this painting was actually created off of some of the scriptures in the book of Revelations, which is in the New Testament of the Bible. And basically, the book of Revelation is about the apocalypse coming, the ending of the world, the rapture. And in the book of Revelations, it talks about how we'll know if the apocalypse is coming because we'll have four signs that they called the four horsemen. The war, so there will be war, that's the first horseman. There will be famine, that's the second horseman. There will be mass disease, third horseman. And then finally, there will be the fourth horseman of death. And we can see all of these four horses depicted here in this painting. Again, this painting was derived from that biblical scripture. Now, what Gottman saw was that there is a connection between conflict behaviors and the potential for romantic married couples to end in a divorce. So the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse is saying that there are four signs or four stages that if you exhibit these stages in regards to conflict in your marital relationship, those could be warnings that the apocalypse, or in this case, the end of your relationship, is going to happen. Now, Gottman has had great success in predicting actual divorce rates, but just know that, of course, there have been extensions of this. For example, we don't talk about it today, but Gottman has also talked about the four antidotes to these four horsemen, so how to get out of this cascading model. But again, this is a theory to explain couples who divorce, how they likely exhibited a particular conflict pattern. Now, this is a cascading model, and what that means is that if you are in stage 2, it's very easy to roll into stage 3. If you're in stage 3, it's very easy to roll into stage 4. So it's a downward slope. So that's what it means by cascading model. Now, when it comes to the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, the first stage is criticism. And this is also called the complaint stage. And criticism includes attacking a spouse's personality or character, usually with blaming language. So Gottman believes that criticizing is an inevitable part of all marriages, but sometimes it can be assessed in a healthy way. But if you are in this complaints and criticism stage, criticism involves making accusations, complaining, having negative comments towards your partner, and you are doing this with the intent that it will somehow harm them on some psychological way. Now, if your partner is complaining to you, is criticizing you over time, that's going to naturally roll or cascade into stage 2, which is that you will build up contempt or disgust for your partner. Now, in this stage, partners will insult and even psychologically abuse one another. So they'll include both verbal and nonverbal communication where they show contempt through things like calling their partner incompetent, lazy, and stupid, Contempt occurs because criticism went unchecked and the conflict escalated unresolved. So that's why it's an easy cascade from complaints and criticism into building contempt and disgust, because if we don't actually address the criticism or complaints that is happening within our romantic relationship, that's going to build up these intensified hostile feelings, which is contempt and disgust. Now, the third stage is defensiveness. And remember, defensiveness is really the need to defend yourself against harm. And harm can be psychological harm or physical harm. Now, if neither spouse is willing to take responsibility for his or her behavior, then that is likely what has cascaded them into stage 3. So, denying responsibility for any wrongdoing when they're engaged in conflict, making excuses, disagreeing, cross-complaining or repeating yourself, or whining instead of actually actively dealing with the conflict is all happening in the defensive stage. So defensiveness is, again, likely a result of contempt and disgust that's built up over time. And if you're in the defensiveness stage, you're so focused on defending yourself and warding off attacks that you're not actively trying to deal with conflict in a constructive way. Now, the last stage is called stonewalling, and this is again a metaphor word that he uses here. So think of speaking to a stone wall rather than a person, or feeling like you can't get past this conflict because you've hit a stone wall that's immovable. Well, that's the metaphor that's used for this final stage, and those who exhibit stonewalling are highly likely to get divorced, according to Gottman's past research. So stonewalling is where the listener, responds to the speaker, but with trite and meaningless expressions. So they're not actively trying to respond to a partner. They're not even trying to defend themselves anymore. They've instead withdrawn and decided that it's not worth fighting for anymore. So that's what stonewalling is. So there's a restriction of communication in any kind of intimate and needed way. Now again, this is a cascading model. So if you enter one stage, you're likely to cascade into the next. So here's an example of some of the things you'd hear at each of these stages. So complaints and criticism: you need to be quiet in the morning so I can sleep. If those complaints and criticisms were repeated over time, of course that could build contempt and disgust. Don't be ridiculous. I was hardly making any noise. You're just overly sensitive. Now, if contempt and disgust has gone unchecked because you're not actively trying to work on the complaints that your partner presented in stage 1, then that likely will cascade you and you'll roll into defensiveness. You don't care about me at all. I'm not ridiculous. You are. No one should have to put up with this. We see in this short example that they're not actively dealing with the conflict. Instead, they're focused on defending their point of view and blaming the other partner. And then finally, stonewalling. I don't want to talk about this anymore. It is a no-win situation. Just leave me alone. Now, in this example, we only see these stages presented within one conversation exchange. But likely, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse happens over a somewhat prolonged period of time, where there's been a lot of repeated complaints and criticism, slowly built up contempt and disgust. When you do engage in conflict, it includes a lot of defensiveness, and then eventually you might get to the point where even defending yourself is useless, so you engage in stonewalling. And we know that those that hit the stonewalling phase are likely to dissolve the relationship. Now, another area of research we need to talk about is, what do we do when there is conflict? So what are the responses to conflict? Now, this has been studied in a lot of different ways. Particularly, they have studied, and I say they as in conflict researchers, have studied 6 conflict styles, and then have also reimagined these or evaluated these into a collection of 3 conflict tactics. Now, before we get into a discussion of these, it's important to keep in mind that, like everything, culture influences conflict. So your book mentions how even our collectivist versus individualistic culture impacts the choices we make in conflict. Biggest difference in these two words is that if you are part of an individualistic culture, which most westernized cultures are, so the US is an individualistic culture, it really focuses on, as an individual, your actions and behaviors and doing what's best for you as an individual. Collectivist cultures, which are a lot of Asian-based cultures, are collectivist in that they're focused on what's best for the group instead of and over above their individual expectations or their individual desires. And we see that this is a trend in culture when it comes to how people talk about families as well. So we can see how that might affect the choices we make in conflict if my society says that I should really do what's best for me as a child, as a spouse, as a parent, versus if I was raised in a culture that says, well, we need to deal with this conflict in a way that will be best for the entire family system. Now let's look really briefly at the 6 conflict styles. You've probably heard of these before: competitiveness, compromising, collaborating, passive aggressiveness, it's also known as indirect fighting, avoidance, and accommodation, which is also known as yielding. Now, very briefly, accommodation is giving in to the other person, so letting another person have what they want. And so you don't likely speak up because you're just giving in or going with whatever the other person says. So that is cooperative in that you're allowing a decision to be made, but it's indirect in that you're not vocalizing disagreement. Avoidance is where you don't speak up at all, but it's not immediately implying accommodation. So you're avoiding the conflict, you're sweeping it under the rug, either because it doesn't matter to you, or maybe you fear negative outcomes if you were to speak up. And this is sometimes helpful, sometimes not, and we'll talk about that. Passive aggressiveness is where you want to appear as if you don't care, or if you're appearing as if you're being accommodative, but your nonverbals are telling a different story. So passive aggressiveness is carried out by your sarcastic tone, by your stance, by the ways in which you're talking about something. So some examples could be, you know what, I'm fine, do whatever you want. You can tell in how I said that I don't actually mean those words. So passive aggressiveness is uncooperative because you're actually implying that you disagree even though your words say something else. Now, competitiveness is where you view conflict as a win-lose situation. You're usually very direct in that you want to leave with the most, or you want to leave conflict as the winner. And of course, this is uncooperative because you orient it as a win-lose situation. I don't see how our goals can converge at all. We are against one another. Compromising, again, it's not fully cooperative as you can see on this chart, because compromising means that both people or both parties involved in a conflict are giving up their original goal to do something that is mutually somewhat satisfying. So you're both not getting your absolute goal in the conflict, but you're compromising on a workable solution. And then collaborating is the one that is the most direct and is the most cooperative that you should strive for, because it means you're spending time and problem solving to come up with some creative way to have both of your goals met. Now that was a very, very brief outlook on the original 6 styles, but your book talks about the 3 different conflict tactics. And these are non-confrontation, solution orientation, and control. And they are very similar in the discussions of the conflict styles because they are basically a reorganization of these original styles. Now, non-confrontation is where people are utilizing avoidance, they're withdrawing from conflict, or they're being really indirect as their tactics. And sometimes this can be helpful because it can avoid, or you can avoid overt conflict when necessary. So we might use avoidance or withdrawal if we are in a particular setting where we can't hash out a conflict. or we can't problem solve and collaborate with our family members because, say, we're at church or say we're at a wedding. So sometimes avoidance can be helpful, but we also know that avoidance has negative outcomes as well because you're not actively trying to deal with the conflict, and it can then boil into something bigger later on down the road. Solution orientation is a dimension that focuses on tactics such as reasoning, compromise, expressing of mutual agreement, and this approach has many advantages because you are showing respect by gaining commitment to the solution with this other party involved. But approaching conflict from a solution orientation requires a great deal of commitment and time and energy, so we don't always have this opportunity. For example, if you and your family are arguing on where to go to eat for dinner and you need to make a decision in 30 minutes, you might not be afforded the time and the creativity to come up with a solution, so you might not be able to focus on solution orientation. You might have to avoid or non-confrontate at that point. And lastly is the control dimension. And this encompasses tactics such as personal criticism, rejecting, hostile jokes, blame. And not shockingly here, these approaches often have a negative or negative, dirty fighting outcome, or they're perceived that way. So control would be things like competition and personal attacks through passive aggressiveness that we've talked about. So those are the various ways that people respond to conflict. Now, before we get into our next discussion, I want to give you a scenario because this is a scenario that will help you understand the idea of power. Now, power is a fundamental concept in conflict theory, and what's interesting about power is that it's seldom discussed, but it undercurrents almost all conflict operations. There's either a presence of power or there's a lack of power. And let me give you this example. If someone says to you, "Get me coffee," depending on their relationship to you, well, you can interpret that phrase in many different ways. If your sibling says, "Get me coffee," that might simply be, could you please get me coffee because we're on the same power level. If your boss or your mother or, someone else says, "Get me coffee," you might interpret that person as being in high power and that you need to comply and get that coffee because they hold that control over you. Within the family system, think of the next example, which is the phrase, "I'd rather you not do that." If your parent says to you as a child, "I'd rather you not do that," that phrase often comes along with some intended power, some intended control. But if someone else said that to you, "I'd really rather you not do that," it might merely be an opinion. So we need to talk a little bit about this idea of power. Now, of course, just like we did with conflict, we need to define it first. Power is defined as a capacity to influence another's goals, rules, roles, and or patterns of communication. So something to think about is that people have power over us to the extent that, one, we depend on them. So if we depend on our parents to pay our bills, or if we depend on our parents to provide us with a roof over our heads, or to provide us with love and affection, they have a perceived power over us because they could take that resource away. So we depend on them. People also have power over us to the extent that they can affect our goal achievement. If your sibling knows something bad that you did and says, "I'm going to tell mom if you don't do this," then they have power over you, perceived power over you, because they can affect your goal achievement of, not being grounded by your parent. People also have power over us to the extent that they have resources that we need. So someone could withhold or provide resources for us, and that gives them power. Again, the example I used with parents being able to give us money if we need it, or a sibling being able to give us a ride to work, or a romantic partner being able to give us affection and intimacy that we need. They have power over us because they have those resources that could be taken away. We also talk a bit in the book about how power is relational. So relational power means that power is the property of the social relationship rather than a quality of the individual. And power evolves and changes over time. Great example is how power changes in our relationship with our parents. When we're young, we need that power from them, that legitimate power of they teach us things, they provide for us. In adolescence, we probably start trying to resist that power and try to be our own person. Later on in life, the power even switches when maybe we are now the caretaker of our parent. So now we're the one in power. And like I said, relational power also means that power is the property of the social relationship rather than the actual individual. So if you identify your friends as family, you might have power in that you have a particular quality your friends like. For example, I'm the planner in my friend group. They love that I am the one that makes decisions and confirms decisions about vacations or about where to eat. So sometimes I have power within my friend group because in that social relationship, I have a quality or a resource they need. So when it comes to relationships, you might also have relational power or control over someone if you are the least committed or the least interested. You might have perceived more power because if that's a romantic relationship that's voluntary, and maybe you're perceived most committed or most interested, then you're the one that wants to stay in the relationship the most. So your partner might have more power than you because they're the least interested, they're the least committed, and therefore can make the decision to leave. So now that we know conflict is inevitable in all close relationships, especially family relationships, because these people are interdependent within a system, one thing we know that is not inevitable is our next topic, which is violence. Unfortunately, we do see that there is a link, though, between violence, power, and conflict. And unfortunately, violence is prevalent within family structures. Now, of course, we're going to define this first. Violence is defined as imposing one's wills, wants, needs, desires on another family member through the use of verbal and or nonverbal acts. And it's done in a way that violates standards that are socially acceptable. Now, it's important to note that there has been a reconceptualization of how we view verbal and nonverbal violence. The terms that used to exist was physical violence and then mental or psychological violence. But the word physical violence was missing out on some of the other ways people might express violent communication. For example, withholding resources you need to survive, so not allowing you to speak to your friends, not allowing you to eat or sleep, or depriving you of things you need, is a form of violence that has physical effects or physiological effects on you that might not be able to be included in the definition of simply physical violence. Because when we hear the term physical violence, we assume someone's physically hitting or touching another person. So verbal aggression refers to that word use, texting use, typed out use that is intended to invoke some kind of psychological pain. So it's trying to hurt your self-concept, it's trying to hurt your self-image or your self-worth. And nonverbal aggression refers to either physical abuse, someone hitting you or physically assaulting you, and as well as keeping resources you need in order to physically survive. So keeping you away from other people, keeping you away from water, from food, from shelter, from sleep. Now, one way we can see a clear link between violence and conflict is in what's called the chilling effect. And the chilling effect says that someone might avoid conflict for fear of the strong negative reactions it will provoke. So there's been quite a bit of research that's shown if someone who has experienced violence before, say by a romantic partner, if something happens to trigger conflict, they might not react and they might not engage in any kind of open conflict management because they fear that if they do, they will experience some kind of verbal or nonverbal aggression. So the chilling effect is that conditioned way of learning not to invoke conflict management and instead avoid out of protection for yourself or maybe protection for a resource like a child. Now the book talks about a couple assumptions about violence, and a lot of these assumptions can be found and discussed in the documentary called Tough Guys, which I've provided a image of here. It's actually two different ones now. There's a Tough Guys 1 and a Tough Guys 2. And it talks about how we in the U.S. live in a very violence-based culture and tries to make some arguments for why that is. So some of the assumptions about violence that is important to us in the U.S. is that we do live in a violent society. Top-rated entertainment ranging from kids shows to R-rated or HBO oftentimes depicts some kind of violence, whether it be verbal or nonverbal. Even the news tends to focus on violence because it sells more stories or people are more likely to listen to it. Violence also does appear to be gendered when it comes to violence is more so perpetuated by males than females. Now, there's a couple of different ways to argue why this might be, and some of these are mentioned in that documentary, Tough Guys. But one huge reason is how we talk about masculinity. We talk about men and boys as needing to grow up to be strong, to roughhouse, to be the best they can, to show physical exertion. So the ways in which we talk about masculinity could be contributing to some of these things, like more proneness for a male to engage in violent communication. We also know violent episodes are perceived differently, so people's cultures, family backgrounds, past experiences provide them with differing viewpoints for assessing the degree of violence that exists in an encounter. So what may be seen as, an overt verbal abuse to one family may simply be aggressive conflict or a heated argument to another. So there are different perceptions of the same violent episode. And lastly, unfortunately, we know that violence within the family is typically not an isolated event. Usually people have experienced this as a pattern. That's why the chilling effect is something that has been seen to be a way of someone to handle or try and get away or not as severely hurt if they know that their partner is prone to violent communication. If any of this is pertinent to your particular experiences, I would encourage you to reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and you see the information here. This is a hotline for domestic abuse by partners or within the family or within the workplace. So please have that information if you need it. Now, we're also going to start a bit of a discussion of stress in this lesson. And you may ask yourself, why are we talking about stress and conflict in the same lesson? Well, stress within the family is inevitable because it comes from changes and family systems change over time. So stress can also stem not just from changes, but stress can stem from conflict. We know that change can cause conflict as well, so things like, I didn't mean to act that way, sorry, I'm just so stressed. But stress can also be a result of conflict. So a conflict has occurred within our family that's made us unclear of what the existing rules and boundaries were, and now that causes conflict. So conflict and stress seem to be interwoven with one another. Now, one thing we do know is that stress causes us uncertainty, and uncertainty causes our body to experience things like anxiety, and physiological reactions to anxiety, like changes in mood, changes in sleep patterns, changes in eating. And so we need to have a discussion here real quick about uncertainty. Now, uncertainty is the inability to explain or predict someone's behavior. As humans, we naturally hate uncertainty. It causes us stress, so we're motivated to reduce it. So cavemen touched the fire once they created it because they were uncertain on if they could trust this or what this fire was. So they did that behavior in order to reduce their uncertainty and gain some knowledge. If I was to tell you you were going on a blind date, the first thing you would do is probably ask me a million questions about your date and or stalk them on social media. Again, we don't like uncertainty. We are motivated to reduce it. Now, what's interesting is that how relationships develop, it should indicate that our uncertainty is lowering over time. So on a first date, we probably have a lot of uncertainty because we don't know this person well. So we are likely high in uncertainty and asking a lot of questions to become more certain. I'm asking more questions to be able to predict and explain the behavior of this partner. When we're dating someone, we can explain and predict better. After we meet their parents, we might understand where they came from a little bit better. And so again, our uncertainty is lowered because we have the ability to predict and explain. Later on down the road, if you've lived with someone for 50 years, you probably can predict and explain their behavior pretty well. So the expectation is that as our relationship develops and is along these different developmental turning points we see listed at the bottom here, that our uncertainty should be lowering. However, we know that that's not always the case because conflict occurs that can make our uncertainty and stress spike. So you've been dating this person for a while and your uncertainty was lowering, but now this person's cheated on you. So now your uncertainty has gone up. You can't predict or explain all of the behavior they've exhibited. Are we going to stay together? Can I trust this person again? So your stress is causing your uncertainty to go up. You've gotten through that, so you have now met the parents, but you've learned that the parents don't approve of you as a romantic partner. So now, even though you've known them and you should be able to predict and explain your partner's behavior, your uncertainty about the relationship has spiked, and that's caused conflict because the parents don't approve. Your uncertainty is lowering again because you got engaged, you got married, you've been together a while, but maybe this partner broke some kind of relational rule, such as forgetting an anniversary. So your uncertainty might spike again. So what this points out is the idea that we naturally don't like uncertainty, and it can cause us stress. But uncertainty can be due to developmental things or unexpected conflict. And both are important in understanding stress, which is why we need to talk about the connection between stress and conflict. Now, the text also talks about the contextual model of family stress. This model says that we cannot focus on stress writ large, but we need to instead look at stressor events and degrees of stress that are impacted by this. So to do so, this particular model, again, the contextual model of family stress, says we need to look to both the external context and the internal context affecting a stressor event within the family. Now, this theory will sound quite similar to ecological systems theory that we've discussed previously, except that this is focused on how external and internal context affect the perception of stress and not on just a child's overall development. So let's look at some of the things here. Now, in the contextual model of stress, it's really focused on the external contexts that are at play that influence how we perceive stress within the family. Now, there are a lot of external context, and you can see some of them listed here. First is the historical frame. So this is the time in history in which a family lives and experiences a stressor. So the book talks a little bit about if you are in a military family and you are having a particular family member deployed. The idea of your particular culture is experiencing a historical war is affecting your perception of stress. It's not just you have a parent in the military, but you have a parent in the military during wartime. So that's an example about how the historical frame can impact your perception of a stressor. Next is the economic frame, and this is closely related to that historical frame. It encompasses the conditions in the family's community. So if you are living, in California in the 1990s, where they had the huge boom in Silicon Valley, a huge tech boom, then your family might have experienced some lessened stress because your community was positively impacted. If instead you were impacted by, say, the recession of 2008, and that caused your community to be so negatively impacted that you are below the poverty line now, of course you're going to experience and perceive stress differently because of that economical context. The third external context is the developmental frame, and this refers to the stage of life that the family is currently in when a stressor occurs. So are you experiencing a stressor and you're a newlywed? Are you experiencing a stressor and you just had your first child? Are you experiencing a stressor when you have just become an empty nester or when you've just experienced a divorce? So the developmental stage of our family also impacts our perception of stress. The hereditary frame is the next one, and it acknowledges that long life and good health are important in our perceptions of stress. So if you have a long history of a lot of illness in your family, then you might perceive stress differently because you have that hereditary knowledge that this is a common illness within your family. Cultural frame is important because culture, as we know, plays a huge role in transmitting and understanding family values and aids in the management of stress. So many of the values that contribute to families' perception of stress is embedded within their culture. So an example is that the textbook uses is that many Asian cultures perceive it as unnecessarily cruel to tell a particular family member that they have a terminal illness such as cancer. So in that particular family, that cultural impact of we don't want to give them a prognosis might alter the perceptions of stress. So those are the external contexts that can affect our perception of stress that we see listed here. Now, there are also internal contexts, and we won't spend a ton of time here, but things like structural, psychological, and the philosophical aspects of a family that impact the perception of stress. So the family receives messages each from the external frameworks we talked about, but also their perception of stress is based on the relational culture of their family. So remember things like our stories that we tell, our themes, metaphors, myths, rituals, conversations, all send powerful messages about the relational culture of our family. And all of these things affect the philosophical understanding of what our family is and should be. We also think of structural parts of a family, so things like family size and family structure. So are we an extended family? Are we a couple-only family? We also have to look at the personal and cognitive functions of family members. So the psychological. Do we have family members that are experiencing autism? Do we have family members that have different cognitive experiences based on some kind of malfunction that's been passed down? So things to think about within the family. Other things in the internal context could be boundaries, rules, and patterns within the family, and family members' perceptions of past stress that has been passed down through narratives and stories that have been told within the family. So again, this is very similar to some of the things we've talked about in previous chapters, particularly ecological systems theory. But the whole point of this model is to understand how stress is perceived differently within the family based on these external and internal contexts. Now, research has also located the two categories to classify stressors. We can better understand what to do when we experience stress or how to lower stress if we can classify it. So developmental, which is also known as normative stressors, is the first category. These are stressors that are part of the human developmental process. So things like birth, death, children reaching puberty, young adults leaving home or getting married, older adults retiring or entering their elderly years, etc. These events account for how normative changes can lead to stress. So change, even expected change, still can cause us stress in that it changes the status quo that we're used to. So the things you see in white here are developmental normative stressors that we'll talk about. Unpredictable or non-normative stressors are those that are unexpected and not part of human development, and thus the family is likely to be caught off guard or not prepared for this event. So of course this can lead to stress as well. These could be moments of crisis or huge conflict issues, some transgressions, so things like we've mentioned in that uncertainty chart, like being cheated on or finding out parents don't approve of you. Some examples could also be things like a house was burned down and you didn't have a plan for it that's affected your family. A parental figure losing a job, the family winning the lottery, a sudden illness that's affected the family. And these are non-normative because these account for the unexpected events that cause stress due to not seeing them coming or being able to prepare for them. Now, let's discuss some of the developmental and unpredictable stressors a family will likely experience. For each, we're also going to note what can be done to aid in this familial stress, so be sure to keep notes of the what to do's mentioned. So some of the developmental or normative stressors we're going to start with, as you see depicted in white. So in young families, and young meaning just now developing families, some of the common stressors are decisions about marriage, decisions about whether to cohabitate with a romantic partner, decisions on whether or not to have children with that partner. So if children are brought into the family must then manage the transition to parenthood if children are involved. So what can we do about these developmental stressors within young families? Well, the number one thing to do to manage some of these stressors is to seek social support. And social support is the process of using communication to help another person manage stress. So if you're unsure whether you should marry your spouse, or if you're unsure whether that you should move in with this potential spouse, you likely seek support through talking to your other family members or through talking to your friend groups. If you are trying to manage being a new parent, you might also seek support from other parents. So social support is huge. In growing families, we also see that there are developmental or normative stressors about being able to provide for children's needs at their various stages of development. So growing families that include children often include stress over teaching children language skills, teaching them how to set boundaries, teaching them how to be disciplined, how to comfort them, how to generally socialize them as children. And it's not shocking that stress may accompany some of these big expectations of you as a parent. So what can we do? Well, parents need a large repertoire of teaching behaviors at their disposal so they can shift from one to another that is most effective when they're experiencing these developmental stressors in teaching their children. They also need to use problem solving with their partner if they have a partner, and make sure that they are enhancing self-esteem in their teachings to their children. When children reach adolescence, still in this growing family section, they also likely are going to utilize, the children are going to utilize in adolescence, topic avoidance as a way to manage this stress. If as a teenager you didn't want to talk to your parents about sex, even if they felt that was something that they wanted to teach you, you might simply avoid this stressor by avoiding the topic of sex altogether with your parent. So that's another option we have in how to manage some of the developmental stressors in the growing family section. For older families, some of the developmental stressors are renegotiating roles. So if one partner, romantic partner, is now retired, or if you are having to transition to a dual earning family once your kids have left the house. And this also includes in this time frame difference or stress over sustaining romantic relationship with a long-term partner. So we know that romantic relationships change once a couple becomes an empty nester or their children have been launched from the home. And we also know that age affects things like sexual desire and physical romance. So that's something else that likely is causing stress for older families. So one way to manage this is to, first off, try and have equal roles. So if you are trying to renegotiate household roles, make sure you have similar responsibilities. Of course, there are health care procedures in sustaining romance, but also reflecting on positive memories and sharing some of the previously helpful romance markers with your partner can help in that. We also know that later on in life, older families experience changes in their sibling relationships. Particularly, siblings don't contact each other as much once they enter adulthood. However, we know that they get back into contact more so once their parents fall ill or become or pass away, because that re-solidifies the significance and importance of their bond. So if you're experiencing stress because your conflict has changed with your siblings later on in family development, what you can do is support each other through social emotional role of remembrance. And this is basically a large term for reminiscing and engaging in storytelling that invokes some of the pleasant memories that you've had in the past. So if you have distance with your sibling because you're older or you're focused on your own family, and it causes you stress, one way to aid in that is to share stories and have this positive reminiscence. Now, lastly, we know that something that affects parent and child relationships for older families is that alteration of roles once a parent ages and potentially a child is now the caregiver of a parent. So one thing that you could do is try and maintain the dialectics between openness and privacy and autonomy and connection that we've talked about previously. So one thing the book notes is that avoidance etiquette is a type of topic avoidance that we use as children in our relationships with our elderly parents. So they might not have the energy to be in conflict with you. They might have differing views now that they are older that you don't agree with. So we see that even older children, when they are caring for an elderly parent, still use topic avoidance. And we also know that it can be hard for us to watch our once powerful parents become someone we need to take care of. And we know that if we are their caregiver, that causes its own stress. So caregivers who view themselves as experiencing a great deal of stress are likely to have negative physiological outcomes, such as being depressed and higher mortality rates. So one thing that you can do if you're experiencing stress because you're the main caregiver of an ailing parent is, instead of talking about the stressor with your parent, engage in sometimes what's called empty speech. And this is using meaningless phrases or cliches or small talk that might be trivial, but it's still engaging with your parent. So what's significant here is that research has shown for elderly parents, the fact of contact is likely to matter more than the substance of contact. So if you feel like you are overly stressed as the caregiver of an ailing parent, you might not need to focus on having really meaningful, intimate conversations with them if that's causing you stress. And it might help you to engage in some of these trivial conversations as well. Now, what you see in black here are common unpredictable or non-normative stressors that are evident in family relationships. We're not going to spend a ton of time here, especially on the first topic, because we have an entire week dedicated to divorce and step families. But we know divorce is oftentimes an unpredicted event that can cause stress to a family system. Now, we will talk about what to do in those experiences of stress when it comes to divorce later on. But know for now that divorce can have stressful effects, not just on the partners going through divorce, but the children as well. Another oftentimes unpredictable stressor that can affect a family is homelessness. Even if just one parent or one portion of the family system is homeless, that can have extended stressors on other family members. For example, who is going to parent children now if the parent is homeless? How does the parent deal with privacy if their family's living on the street? How do they deal with safety? How is their health affected if they are now homeless and not having a shelter to go to? What legal issues happen if you get arrested for squatting or for being homeless? And of course, this affects the stability of the socialization development of children if a parent is homeless as well. So this is an uncommon but definitely unpredictable stressor that could affect families that your book has more information on. The last one that the book talks about is job loss. So particularly if a parent loses a job that was needed in order to provide for children or provide for the family in general. And usually job loss is not predicted. Even the recession of 2008, even though people in the housing market said that they could see it coming, oftentimes people that were affected by the recession had not prepared for it in a realistic way. So we know that job loss can cause stressors throughout the family. I know that I entered college around the time of, or a little bit before the time of the recession, and my father lost his job. So the idea of him losing his job affected me because he was paying for me to go to college at the time. So I felt an added stress of doing well in college because he was overexerting himself in order to, really try to make up for that. So what can we do if we're experiencing stress due to job loss in the family? Well, research has said that it's helpful if the person who lost a job or the family that experiences this loss focuses on finding routine. So focuses on finding a new routine over and above just talking about job loss. If they focus on staying unemployed and more on, instead of focusing on staying unemployed, they focus more on getting a job, no matter what the job is. And volunteering at family events or community events, whether at school or at home, can relieve some of the stress we might experience due to job loss. Now, the last part that we will discuss today is similar to a concept that I brought up a week or so ago, and that is resilience. Much of research focuses on conflict and stressors relevant to families, but doesn't give the next step or the next portion of the research to tell us, okay, what's next? What do we do? So research oftentimes fails to explain how we can combat stress or how we can better manage family conflict. But resilience research does attempt to do so. So remember, resilience is the ability to bounce back, meaning return to normal or make it through after a stressor or after a conflict or after adversity. And there's even the potential, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, of thriving in the aftermath of such adversity. So the point of learning what leads to resilience is that we can utilize these behaviors in the future to protect us against potential adversity. So some resilience scholars say that being resilient provides us with different options and different tools that we can put in a toolbox, and we have that toolbox in the future if we experience more conflict or adversity. So the book does a great job at explaining the various communication behaviors that contribute to resilience. So I just want to really briefly go over some of these. The first one we've talked about already, storytelling, or telling stories of resilience that we talked about in a previous lecture, can actually help us bounce back from conflict or help us manage conflict and help us deal with stress. So if you're experiencing high stress in your family because of a developmental or a non-normative stressor, a family member can tell you a story about how they made it through in the past. And you can use that story and the lessons you learn from that story to be resilient in your own stressor experience. Also, asking and receiving social support helps make us resilient. Now, this was a common theme in the last slide's discussion of what can we do when we experience some of these developmental stressors. Well, we can reach out to others, get advice from others, get comfort from others, and social support actually helps us be able to bounce back and survive some adversity. Extending and accepting forgiveness. If you are experiencing conflict with a family member that you intend to eventually continue a relationship with, maybe simply because it's an involuntary relationship, being able to forgive them about a previous transgression, being able to get through a hard time by communicating why you forgive them or why they forgive you, might be needed in order to get through that conflict or get through that tough time. We also see that everyday positive messages and everyday rituals that have a positive undertone can help make us resilient. So in the example of your parent lost a job, one of the things on what we could do was simply finding a different routine, finding an everyday routine and focusing on that above and beyond the idea of we are without a job. So everyday positive messages and rituals can also relate to this idea of crafting normalcy. And these are things that are still normal in family despite the upheaval caused by the stressor or by the conflict. So even though you've experienced some kind of terrible setback like an illness or a job loss, maybe you're focusing on we still get to eat breakfast every morning together. And that's important to us. We're still going to try and go to the ball games on Friday because that's how we normally would act as a family without this stressor. And that actually helps people get through hard times when it comes to conflict or adversity. Affirming identity anchors. This could be saying things like, we're still a family. This happened to us, but we're still a family. This is who we are. So storytelling when it comes to stories about identity could be included here. Maintaining and using communication networks. So saying things like we have resources and friends that we can call on for help. This maintaining and then using these networks would be an example of utilizing social support that's mentioned above. Putting alternative logics to work is basically a way to reframe a difficult or adverse situation and thinking of it as a more of a challenge, an opportunity, than say a disaster or a crisis. So saying things like, this is a really tough time, but we're going to come out of it stronger. I hate that this happened to us, but I think there's a huge lesson we can learn from here. Right? So putting alternative logics to work is basically thinking and reframing the situation as a learning opportunity or as something that could be positive in the long run. And that actually helps people get through or even thrive through difficult times. And we also see that downplaying negative feelings while foregrounding positive emotions can be really important. So talk about the elements in the family life that are positive and that can help get through the challenges that relate to positive emotions over and above the negative feelings. So talking about the stressor and how it can elicit hopefulness or how it can cause you to increase your faith or increase your self-efficacy is actually indicative of people being more resilient than focusing on feelings of guilt or feelings of anger or something like that. So that's a lot that's in this lecture. So again, we're covering 2 large chapters here and talking about how conflict and stress are intertwined and how power violence is undercurring some of that stress and conflict. And finally, we ended with a stance on how we can be resilient in the wake of some of these things.